Phil Robertson, you are the Deputy Director of the Human Rights Watch Asia Division. Thank you for meeting with us. Could you please tell me about your work in Thailand?
Based here in Bangkok, I oversee our work in about 7 or 8 different countries in Southeast Asia. And part of the reason I'm talking to you today about the issue of fisheries and human trafficking is that prior to joining Human Rights Watch, I was a consultant and working on a number of different projects, including writing a report for the International Organization for Migration on trafficking of persons onto the fishing vessels in Thailand. And so spent a great deal of time looking into the issue, traveling to most of the major fishing ports in Thailand to talk to the employers, the fishing boat captains, of course the fishermen themselves, NGOs and others who are working with them. And as a result, we came up with a report. This report had major recommendations that were actually proposed to and broadly accepted by the Thai government's National Anti-Trafficking Committee. This committee was set up under the National Anti-Trafficking Act of 2007. So all the key government agencies were there.
How many migrant workers there are in Thailand today?
It's hard to say, frankly. There's a very porous borders between Thailand and its neighbors. We estimate there's probably between 3 to 4 million migrant workers from Cambodia, Cambodia, Burma, and Laos. But we don't have specific figures, and frankly, I don't think the Thai government does either. They continue to do registration exercises. This latest registration exercise has registered over 1 million. But it's unclear whether this is the same group that was previously registered at the last registration exercise 2 years ago. And there's no effective way to monitor the influx of migrants. There's all sorts of illegal brokering to bring people in. So it's almost impossible to give you a solid statistical number of how many migrant workers there are at any given time in Thailand.
What is the biggest challenge those workers face?
There's impunity to abuse them. As we found when we did a major report for Human Rights Watch from the tiger to the crocodile, we found that employers, corrupt officials and police, and local thugs recognize that migrant workers have almost no protection here. So it's very easy to extort them, to physically and sexually abuse them, and to traffic them. In the case, for instance, of the fishing fleets, people say, well, how do these men end up on these fishing boats? How do they get tricked on there? It's surprisingly easy. What you have is brokers in their home countries offering employment at a factory on land, or perhaps a farm or some other enterprise. These men are told that they can travel now and that they will pay back the debt later through deductions of their earnings. And they've never been to Thailand. They don't speak Thai. In fact, a lot of times they don't even know where they're going. And instead of ending up at a factory, they end up at a fishing port where they're forced onto a fishing vessel. I've spoken to trafficked fishermen who escaped from boats, people from Cambodia who had never seen the ocean before they were actually forced onto a boat. So, and it happens time and time again. It is not terribly difficult, given the way that the brokerages and the corruption runs here in Thailand, to do this. The question is, what is the Thai government actually going to do to stop it? Those recommendations, based on the studies that were done by the IOM, were presented in that report. And that report, essentially, many of those recommendations have just been left alone. Nothing has happened to them. So issues, for instance, of using regulatory interdiction, for instance, when the boats are leaving port, providing assistance to the marine police so they can effectively patrol and stop boats and check fishermen. Things like going on board, there's resupply vessels, that resupply boats that go overseas, where trafficked fishermen are among the things that are resupplied by those vessels. These are key things that could be done by the Thai government, and they haven't been. The legislation that oversees the fishing sector was well before there was any sort of commercial fishing fleet. It's dated back in 1947. There's effectively no oversight or regulations of the industry, and the fishing boat owners and the captains have responded to the deficiencies or the shortages of labor in the sector by essentially dragooning people through broker networks onto these boats, trafficking them, and what we found was, as a result, there are significant abuses that are taking place. Fishermen being abused, in some cases killed.
I've heard of the many cases of physical punishment. Why do you think those workers are being beaten and punished?
You got to understand the way a fishing boat is manned here. You have a Thai captain and a first mate. You have one or two other Thais. Usually you'll have a crew chief who is from the majority group on the boat. So the majority are Burmese, he's Burmese. And they are essentially forced to work whenever there's enough fish in the area that they're fishing. So, they might be working 20, 22 hours a day, when the boat is out and working. And people get tired. People falter. People make mistakes. And the captains will physically abuse people who they see making mistakes. So, for instance, we had captains who, like, if a fisherman sorted a more valuable fish into a pile of less valuable fish, one of them told me they did that and they were whipped with the tail of a stingray. We had another guy who was killed because he basically took time off to defecate overboard. And the captain punched him so many times and then just basically threw him overboard and he drowned. This is the sort of thing that can happen because the captains want to enforce total, complete compliance through fear. And that's what they do.
Is this something that also happens between labor brokers and the workers when they're getting to the boats?
Well, what happens is when the captains are going to take on traffic labor, for instance, they're going to take a boat out and they're perhaps short 4 or 5, maybe 10 individuals and they need to recruit them. They will make calls to people they know in the port and men will be brought to the pier by a broker. At that point, there's very little that the man can do. I mean, obviously they can try to run away at that point, but they'll probably be caught and beaten. The brokers enforce or control the men to the point that they're put on the boat. And there's various facilities that they have in these ports to do that. So, sometimes it's the men are brought right in, they're basically held very briefly and then put right on the boat. Sometimes they're held a little bit longer, but the idea is to minimize the amount of time of transition between land and the boat once they arrive in the port area.
What are some of the ways for those workers to respond to that situation and address abuse? Are there any channels for them to complain about that situation?
Very few. What we found in most cases is that persons who escape trafficking on fishing boats escape of their own accord, they basically are able to escape and by themselves without assistance. Sometimes overseas they're escaping into the jungles in Indonesia and Malaysia. Sometimes they're able to seek assistance from other groups of fishermen who have run away. Sometimes they just get simply lucky. I mean, I spoke to one man who was so desperate he finally just jumped off the boat with a float and floated for 2 or 3 days in the ocean and actually was picked up by another boat that happened to be going back to Thailand. So we're not seeing any sort of system set up for people to be able to reach out or seek assistance.
And the police would not help in this case?
In most cases not. I mean, what you find is the land-based police, particularly in port areas, tend to be complicit with this. They know what's going on. Where we found some exceptions to that was in the marine police, where they were actually the people who patrol. The marine police have the duty to patrol out to 12 nautical miles. The problem is that the marine police don't have enough petrol to run their boats for more than between 6 to 8 hours a month. So, for the marine police to make a decision that we're going to go out and inspect a boat, they have to have very solid, actionable information. They don't get to just sort of patrol and stop every fishing boat that's leaving a port area, because very quickly they'd run out of petrol. So, one of the recommendations, for instance, of that IOM report that I mentioned was that Thailand should recognize that the Marine Police have a major role to play. They should make the Marine Police sort of the hero here of anti-trafficking efforts, and provide them with the necessary resources and training to do their jobs and to basically be able to stop and check boats that are going out of ports on fishing missions. And and look at the crew list. Look at the documents of the crew, have a Burmese or Khmer speaker, so that if there's someone who has been trafficked and wants to get off the boat, that they would be able to say that. None of that's in place now.
Do you think the companies know what is really going on those fishing boats?
Well, I think they would have had to have their head in the sand to not have read some of the global media coverage of this situation and of these abuses on the fishing boats. They may not know the actual details, but, fish being caught by Thai fishing vessels are tainted by forced labor and human trafficking. This is a systematic and pervasive practice in this industry. Without trafficked fishermen, the current fishing fleets would not be able to operate the way they do in Thailand. And, people can talk around that, but that's the inconvenient truth that people sourcing fish or other marine products from Thailand need to understand. Now, recently, there's been a divide between sort of fish on one hand, wild-caught fish, of course, which was coming from boats, and then sort of shrimp, where people saying, well, shrimp's not tainted because shrimp is raised in these aquaculture arrangements on these ponds on land. But what we have found now, and this was recently exposed by The Guardian, is that some of the trash fish that has been caught by the Thai fishing boats is then being sold to major companies that are turning it into shrimp meal that are being fed to the shrimp. And then those shrimp being raised on trafficked products, the fish from these trafficked fishermen, are being exported to North America and to Europe.
What are some of the steps that the companies can take to address this problem?
Well, I think that they need to press the Thai government to really tackle the problem of human trafficking on these fishing boats. It's very interesting that we had all the discussions. There was all these interagency meetings. There was, examining the results of the reports. There's been other reports since then that still show it's a problem. But the actual recommendations are just left to lie there. It seems to me that the recommendations have either met the bureaucracy and lost, or also perhaps more tellingly, that the fishing boat owners and the captains have effectively thwarted some of these efforts to try to change policy. Because to change and move away from human trafficking as a core element of the Thai fishing paradigm, you're going to have to change the industry. The industry has grown up this way without regulation because it's the best way to earn maximum profits for the fishing industry. They're going to have to make some changes. They're going to have to improve their recruitment. They're going to have to pay people more. They're not going to be able to work fishermen 22 hours, 7 days a week, and whip them when they're not able to perform their duties. They're not going to be able to, pay 12,000 or 14,000 baht at the pier to buy a trafficked man, whose first day in Thailand sees him put on a boat and beginning a nightmare.
What are some of the ways for the companies to address the challenges related to those indirect channels of recruiting migrant workers?
Well, see, Thailand has got many different layers of brokerage and recruitment. The problem is that the Thai Ministry of Labor has continually set out procedures that are so bureaucratically arcane that you basically have to outsource the recruitment process because it's so complicated. And getting the workers where you need to get them, these human resource managers a lot of time don't have time to do that. The other problem is that Thailand has not effectively regulated the people being brought into the country. You have brokers from Burma or from Cambodia who are bringing these workers in, a lot of times it's going through this MOU, government-to-government process. But it's in some ways more expensive. And when the workers get to their workplace, they still face the same problems that workers who are undocumented face, which is their documents are taken away. They are essentially unable to leave the factory in many cases without fear of arrest and extortion. They are paid much less than they're promised and less than the minimum wage. The other various different guarantees in the contract that they might have signed in Burma and Cambodia are not being met. There's no effective regulation of those contracts by the Ministry of Labor in Thailand. And if you complain, you will face retaliation by the employer and or hench persons who are in their employ. So, we had cases where workers complained to the Ministry of Labor local office. They were followed home by the police and beaten up. The police were working for the employer. We had cases where a guy was trying to get his back wages, and when he dared to sort of assert that he should be paid, the manager said, "Okay, come back this evening, after hours." He came back after hours, and the manager stabbed him in the head with a screwdriver and, dumped him on the side of the road. So these are the sort of things that you hear from migrant workers. When people stand up for their rights, when people demand what they should be paid or what they're owed, they face retaliation.
Do you think the establishment of written contracts by the employer with the worker would solve that problem in some way?
Well, there should be a contract between the employer and the worker. And, they shouldn't have situations where, for instance, a broker is employer of record, so the employer is paying the broker and is paying the worker. But more importantly, they should fundamentally rework the way the system happens here. They should be basically having migrant workers register directly with the government, for a period of time like 4 to 5 years, and then allow them to have employment portability. So, for instance, if they face a situation with an abusive employer, they would do what you or I would do, which is like, I'm not going to work here anymore. I'm going somewhere else. The current system constrains that by placing people with an employer, and they're supposed to stay with that employer. It becomes very difficult to get away from that employer and still maintain your legal status. You have to go through a whole process at the government, at the Ministry of Labor, to show that somehow your rights have been violated. But to do that invites retaliation. So it would be much better to simply have people able to change employers as they like and inform the government. The portability of employment to be able to change workers would essentially mean that the labor market forces would support better labor practices, because the employers who treat workers badly would have a hard time retaining workers, whereas employers who treat them well would be essentially have more workers than they know what to do with. The system as it's set up here it's a sort of in loco parentis kind of arrangement where, the government essentially is handing over control of the migrant workers to the employers with the idea that the employers are going to keep track of them, keep them under control. At its most basic element, the Thai migrant worker policy is also a national security policy. You have this current military government for sure, but also the police oriented towards control of migrant workers, and they use the employers as the de facto controllers. The employers are okay with that because that essentially means that they have often bound labor, people who cannot flee without losing status. The costs of, for instance, bringing the worker in and getting a work permit, those are costs that, according to policy and law, are supposed to be borne by the employer. But almost every employer transfers those costs to the employee by deducting money from their salary. So what you're saying is that the employers are saying, we want to be able to control the migrant workers, we want to be able to make them pay to work for us, and we want to be able to continue to pay sub-minimum wages and abuse them in other ways because we know they can't go anywhere. That is a system that encourages human trafficking. That is a system that encourages forced labor and abuses. That is a system that needs to be fundamentally rethought. And the way they should rethink it is that the migrant workers should be registered directly with the government and become essentially free agents, be able to move in a period of time as a legally registered worker and to work for whom they want.
When you talk about the workers being registered with the government, do you mean the MOU channel?
We could set up any sort of system. There is a registration process now where workers, provide their name and information to be given status to remain in the country. That could be changed. Ideally, this system would be one where, for instance, a migrant worker's obligation would be to inform the Thai government if you're changing an employer. So, for instance, if I was working at a paint factory here and I decided that the supervisor was cheating me and I didn't like working there and I decided to move to a rice mill, all I would have to do is send a postcard or somehow inform the Thai government that I had changed employers. But there would be no permission, there'd be no requirement to do this. Essentially I would be like anybody else, able to choose what employment I want to work for.
That presents a problem for the illegal migrant workers. Whenever they come to the country, they say they don't have similar rights and they can't change employers. What would be the solution for them?
Well, what you would have is what the Thai government has done, which is they periodically have amnesties and registrations for persons who are undocumented migrant workers. There's nothing in human rights law that basically says you have the right to illegally enter a country and stay. The issue of immigration is something that is controlled by governments. But what there should be is there should be a process of transitioning people out of illegal status into a legal status, in part because Thailand needs the workers. Thailand, wants migrant workers. During the time right after the military junta came in here, where over 220,000 Cambodians fled the country because they were scared of a military government crackdown on them. There was a great deal of panic within employer circles, like where are all the workers going? What are we going to be able to do? The eastern seaboard, going down towards the Cambodian border, all those plantations, all those animal husbandry enterprises, all those things, they require migrant workers. So, ultimately the government said, well, we didn't mean to send everybody out and everybody's welcome back, and they basically, most of the Cambodians have come back. But every time that happens, there's a panic amongst employers because they don't have the workers to do the kind of work that they want with the sort of wages and conditions they're currently offering.
What would be the best way to handle recruitment from the company's perspective?
If I were a company and I was organizing this, ideally I would like to be able to sort of recruit my own workers. I'd like to be able to work it out myself. I have these certain needs. These are the people I need, these are the groups that I want, and how do I then arrange that? Recruitment implies costs. So, if a company is going to operate using migrant workers, they're going to have to sort of step up and recognize that it's going to cost them some money to do the recruitment. So far the Thai companies have essentially had people been delivering migrant workers to them and then paying, but then deducting the money from the migrant workers themselves. That all has to stop. There has to be a rethink and rejiggering of the industry so that, there might be sort of, for instance, approved migrant brokers from Cambodia and approved migrant brokers from Burma. If you say, okay, I want to bring in this number of workers, you talk to the Thai government. The Thai government then sort of does a deal with this group where these people are brought in on this sort of employment status for a number of years and sent to your factory. Then it's up to you to, treat the workers fairly and pay them enough so that they want to stay.
I've heard that the legal process of bringing the workers into Thailand through the MOU channel takes over 3 months, which is too long, and it poses a problem, basically encouraging the illegal migration and bringing the workers illegally.
Well, 3 months is, to be honest, 3 months is not that long. What are they complaining about? If they've got a business planning model that is worth that they can basically plan that we're going to need workers in 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months' time. What you have is the 3-month model versus like pay money and tomorrow they arrive because they're undocumented. You know, there's been an addiction to undocumented migrant workers by Thai businesses that, you know, I can get them tomorrow if I have the money. And that's the way the system has worked. But the problem is the way that system works is it's all about profits and exploitation rather than legality and creating sustainable employment relationships that benefit both the worker and the enterprise. So this is the report that the IOM put out about trafficking of fishermen in Thailand. This report was considered by the National Anti-Trafficking Committee of the Thai government, which is the interagency government committee that oversees all aspects of policy on human trafficking. And at a meeting that was chaired by Deputy Prime Minister, it was approved and agreed that the recommendations had merit and needed to be implemented in some way, shape, or form. Since that time, however, very little's been done.
What are some of the challenges? Why do you think it hasn't been done?
I think that there's a lack of cooperation from the fishing industry. Mm-hmm. I think that because the core problem has been that the regulatory oversight of the industry is completely splintered. There's no one ministry or agency involved or in all aspects of this. You know, for instance, the fishermen are controlled by the Ministry of Labor, the boats are by the Port Department, the Department of Fisheries oversees issues related to equipment. The law itself overseeing fisheries is completely outdated and needs to be fundamentally rewritten. You know, that was actually something that the UN, the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, has recommended to the Thai government, and it's not been done. So, with no effective oversight of the industry, which is the way the industry effectively wants it, it becomes very difficult to have a comprehensive response with the recommendations that we set out when this report was written and presented to the Thai government.
Are there any suggestions for the companies?
Well, the focus of this report was really on the government. My recommendation to the companies would be get the government to get a comprehensive policy along the lines of what the IOM and others have been recommending. Because, you know, the companies are going to try to fix the problem in their supply chains without recognizing that the larger regulatory oversight of the industry is so fractured that it's dysfunctional.
I've heard that there are some positive changes with the recent military government, and also from some of the brokers that the MOU channel is the best way to handle that problem. Would you agree with that?
Let's see how it plays out. I mean, you know, everything has been focused on the issue of recruitment, but nothing has been focused on dealing with how do you stop the trafficking of people on the fishing boats and how do you help the people on the fishing boats now. You know, the focus on recruitment reflects the predominant role of the fishing boat owners and the captains, because, you know, their major problem when they look around, they say, well, the problem is we don't have enough fishermen. So we need to recruit more fishermen. How are we going to get more fishermen? And that has been driving the policy discussion. Now, in parts of it, it's because the recruitment, of course, is quite corrupt, and often the recruitment is deception and forcing men on the boats. So, of course, that needs to be improved. But I haven't yet seen a system that has been set up that is going to guarantee protection of persons who are recruited once they get on the boats. And that was the idea that came out in this report, was that there was supposed to be some sort of hiring hall concept where there would be a standard package and a monitoring mechanism put in place so that fishermen who go through a hiring hall would have guarantees of protection and timely payment of wages according to contracts, written contracts. That still is not a reality.